just to kind of tell you a little bit about me. So I'm second generation Chinese American. So my parents are from China and they came to the US via Taiwan in the late 60s. And so my dad came to study here and we lived in Texas. So I grew up in Texas and that was actually a really formative experience for me because I was like one of two or three Asian Americans that I knew like until I was like 18. So I grew up in a really like white Latino community. And so I think growing up, I always was interested in navigating cultural difference, right? So there's, for many of us who are children of immigrants, it's like the culture at home is so different than the culture at school or the culture in your community. And you sort of just learn it, but like bringing some awareness to like, wow, I actually have to act differently. The norms are different. The language is different. Like all of that made me very interested in general in culture and how it shapes behavior and also then how to bridge difference. So those themes have really become kind of an intellectual interest of mine. So as a college student at the University of Texas at Austin, I studied psychology and I studied Asian studies because I started to become really interested in my own racial and ethnic identity and wanting to learn Mandarin. And so then I was taking classes in sort of Asian studies. And at that time, they didn't have Asian American studies. So it was like Asian studies. And so I studied abroad in Taiwan and in China. And then as a grad student, I decided to become a psychologist because I was taking these psychology classes and then realizing like, wow, a lot of the things I'm learning in class, I cannot see how it applies to my own family or even to myself. So the theories were very ethnocentric, not very globally informed, not very culturally aware. And so I started being very interested in kind of cross-cultural issues in psychiatry and psychology, mental health, reading about like anthropologists who were studying different cultural experiences abroad. And then for graduate school, I found a number of incredible Asian American psychologists who were just beginning to create this field of Asian American psychology. And so I got to work with Dr. Stanley Su at UCLA, who had just gotten a huge grant from NIMH to create the National Research Center on Asian American Mental Health. So it became this like hub of Asian American psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, sociologists, all kind of doing a lot of like groundbreaking research trying to just describe the mental health experiences of Asian Americans. So it was really exciting to be part of that as a student, being surrounded by these scholars doing all this really cool work. And so I became a professor, started a private practice, worked at the New School for many years. Actually, before I got my first academic job, I took this interest in culture and I did a postdoc at Harvard Medical School in this really fascinating program they have on clinically relevant medical anthropology. So it was bringing together my interest in sort of anthropological views in culture, really like local understandings of experience versus like taking like the DSM and like trying to force it to fit on every group across the globe. So I got to work with a lot of the leading figures in transcultural psychiatry who were doing ethnographic work to try to describe local experiences of distress outside of like psychiatric terms, just kind of letting it sort of arise from the culture. So a lot of these folks were really influential in my thinking about culture and how it shapes experience, how it shapes how we express distress, how we sort and give words and labels to diagnostic concepts, and then critically how we work with it. How do we treat different psychiatric conditions. So from that, I was director of clinical training at the new school. And one of the things that happened along the way, though, is I started to feel really constrained in some ways by the field of psychology, which is very intrapsychically focused. It's like really focused on your experience, your thoughts, your reactions, your emotions, but it kind of, in a sense, treats the person as kind of isolated from that larger context. Like our interventions are very intrapsychically focused. And it started to feel more and more like a little bit of a misfit in some ways with a traditional psychology department. And so it was like really exciting to actually come to Silver, where there is so much focus in your training as MSW students and also DSW and PhD on looking at systems and policies and structures and how that increases vulnerability and risk for certain populations and buffers risk for others. And so it's been really fun. It's been really great. I came here in 2019 and continued to do the work that I do, but just the environment is a little more conducive, I think, to partnering with folks who also have this larger macro focus. So yeah, the concept of critical consciousness is something that I discovered, maybe 10 years ago, and it kind of gave language to what I feel like I've been trying to do in my work through my teaching, through my research and through my clinical practice, which is kind of fostering this awareness, especially for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, about how the systems that they live in, and in a sense that we're sort of trapped in, kind of can increase our risk for certain mental health difficulties. It can impede our progress in school and career. And so many times we blame ourselves as BIPOC for why we haven't achieved enough, or why we struggle so much, or why we're so anxious in spaces that we find ourselves. And so the concept of critical consciousness begins with this kind of awareness of how systems shape us and oppress us, or sort of elevate some groups over others. And then through more education and through, I think, community building, it can activate this motivation and this hope that things can change. So it can sort of have this catalytic process for folks. And I feel like for a lot of us who teach here at Silver, whether it's drop or policy, like we're really trying to inspire students to be part of change processes, to motivate us to be able to see solutions, to work towards solutions. And so the third part of the critical consciousness construct is around critical action. So taking this awareness and knowledge, taking that sort of hope and community connections, and turning that into actions that can affect change. So that idea of sort of the developmental process that we go through, this kind of awakening process, learning about what we can do and then taking action, that shapes how I teach. It shapes how I work with patients. And so some of my research is really trying to look at different parts of that change process. Well, I think it's important to not believe that there's only one way to be effective in making change. A lot of the research on, like, say, collective action has really focused on like activism, like going to protests, community organizing, um, sort of focusing on political change, political activity. And yet a paper that came out from my team, we were looking at Asian Americans and how the COVID-19 pandemic was this like awakening process for a lot of us. And we were kind of looking at predictors and processes of different forms of collective action. And collective action in our view, like we thought it was actually really important to not only look at political action, political activity, political organizing, but to look at other forms of collective engagement, including like supporting BIPOC-owned businesses. Like we might not think of that as a sort of a radical social change action, but it's actually really critical because during COVID, for example, Asian-owned businesses really suffered, right? People stopped going to Chinatowns. They stopped going to Asian-owned businesses and restaurants and things like that. And so you're talking about, community members whose livelihoods are being affected because of really sort of racialized consumer habits, right? And so even something like that, like doing your holiday shopping, but to support BIPOC-owned businesses is a kind of social action or critical action you can take. So I think that the idea of critical action comes from, what makes it a critical action is that it's coming from this like informed perspective, that you sort of understand how your decisions, the activities that you engage in, are connected to an idea of sort of what systems change can look like, right? Of course, we can also just engage in really important actions on a much more local level, and that can include just like, a classmate might have experienced a microaggression from a student in your class. And so you can, as an observer of that process, you can support that classmate publicly. You can call attention to what just happened and try to invite a conversation around it. You can model a different way of using words or interacting with diverse students, diverse faculty, So even those smaller actions I would put in the category of critical actions. It's just we're looking at actions that are sort of informed by this larger structural awareness. And all the way up to like advocating for policy change, running for office, like all of those things, are different forms of critical action. Diagnostic concepts are useful, right, in creating some uniformity in how we talk about certain things, but I feel like with the work that I've done with Asian Americans, sometimes the concepts don't fit so neatly, right? And also there can be, more of a focus on the mind-body connection, right? How stress affects the body and sort of health in addition to mental health. So, and there's lots of different ways that different Asian American groups think about it. And we know that Asian Americans are so diverse. So a lot of my work is focused on Chinese Americans, and the way that we're raised to pay attention differently to our bodies, to our experience, to others, very much shapes how we, how we come to understand what mental health is and what our treatment goals might be too. Obviously, like every clinician approaches it a little bit differently, but I will say that the connective tissue is an interest in culture and an interest in contemplative practices of all kinds, right? So many of us do mindfulness-based interventions, like using mindfulness formally or informally. Some of us have experience with mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindfulness-based compassion training. Like there's different manualized approaches to using contemplative treatments. And then there's more informal approaches, like the research does suggest that mindfulness is associated with a lot of psychological benefits. So I have found it personally to be a really great adjunct to something like cognitive behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy. So all of us in the practice integrate contemplative approaches, including mindfulness, into the work that we do. Yeah, there's so many ways to learn mindfulness. Like, I think that it is important to develop a personal practice and not just treat it as like a technological intervention. Like, just like, when you're learning anything, it can be really important for you to experience it yourself first, which is why it's so great for students who want to become practicing clinicians that they themselves go through therapy, right? So they know they have some insight into what that experience is like. So I feel like for mindfulness in particular, it's important for you to have your own practice because it gives you more insight and compassion for how it can be really difficult for your clients to learn, to stick with. It can be really challenging. But so one of the things I like to recommend to my patients is the work of Sharon Salzberg. So she is an insight-oriented meditation teacher. She is actually local, like she keeps a place here in the city. I got to study with her as part of a program I did through the Nalanda Institute, which had a 2-year program in mindfulness and compassion training for clinicians. But she has a book called Real Happiness. I use it all the time with my patients, like because it's a little paperback. It's a 28-day program, so it kind of walks you through this developmental process of learning about mindfulness and then kind of taking baby steps to strengthen attention, concentration through focusing first on your body, looking at emotions, looking at your thoughts, and then looking kind of at interpersonal processes like communication. So it kind of is this like thing that builds on itself. And the thinking is, it can take like at least 28 days to build a habit. And so it includes like tracks you can listen to. There's like different chapters for each week. So I really like that as like a self-paced intro to mindfulness, but there's a number of other things, and I can sort of share some of these resources with you offline. But another one I like is by Tara Brach, called Mindfulness Daily. It's like a 40-day program. And again, it's free, and you just like play these little recordings. And then, of course, going on retreats, I think can be really good just in terms of building your own private practice. So I think once you have your own practice going, there are a lot of other trainings that you can do that cost varying amounts. If you're interested in mindfulness-based stress reduction, which was the first like empirically supported intervention program that used mindfulness and other kinds of contemplative practices to treat chronic illnesses. So it's used to treat like hypertension, blood pressure, pain. It's one of the most well-researched programs. It's 8 weeks long. It's pretty time intensive. It's administered in a group. You can take an MBSR course like all over the city, but like that's a really great like way to kind of get a deep dive into what mindfulness can look like using an evidence-based intervention. And there's just like a lot of those other ones that become more open to you. I think once you have some insight into what it's like and whether it's right for you.